And what this is going to show are some chemical bonds. This should all be reviewed. So the first kind of chemical bond that you're going to need to know about is a hydrogen bond. This is what we talked about with properties of water. So this is what happens when you have hydrogen atoms that aren't real great at hanging on to electrons. When they're in other when they're connected to other atoms and molecules, they end up being a little bit positively charged. And those slightly positively charged hydrogen atoms can then stick to anything that has a negative electrical charge, even a partial negative charge. And this happens with oxygen, like in water, but it can also happen with nitrogen and fluorine, because those are pretty electronegative. It can be attracted to ions. Hydrogen bonds can form, it's not just between oxygen and water. Anytime the slight positive charge of a hydrogen atom connects it to something else, you get a hydrogen bond. And hydrogen bonds are not super strong. Those electrical charges are only partial, so they're relatively easy to break. It's not that they don't do anything at all, but they're not as sturdy as some of the other bonds that we'll look at. So we already talked about hydrogen bonds in water. Another place where we see hydrogen bonds is in DNA. The backbone of DNA, and we'll talk about all this stuff down the road, this is just an example. The backbone of DNA is held together covalently, really strong bonds, but the rungs on that DNA ladder are hooked together with hydrogen bonds. And there's either 2 or 3 hydrogen bonds depending on which of the nitrogenous bases is in action. And so what that ends up meaning from a functional standpoint is that individual strands of DNA are hard to break apart, but 2 strands of DNA coupled in a double helix are relatively easy to separate, which is handy because you need to separate the double helix when you're replicating DNA or when you are creating mRNA strands that are going to be used to encode proteins. Okay, the next kind of bond is an ionic bond. This is a pretty sturdy bond as well. This is when you get an electron fully moving or very close to fully moving from one atom to another. It creates an ion. And those ions can be positive or negative depending on whether they've lost or gained electrons. You can have multiple charges. And because of that electric charge, ions can stick together. And they stick together the same way that magnets do. It's not the same force, but it's an aspect of the same force. The electromagnetic force is one phenomenon, and ions are just one branch of that phenomenon, the electric part of electromagnetic. And what's interesting is that these bonds are pretty sturdy in lots of circumstances, but they're actually relatively easy to break in other circumstances. So if you have a polar solvent, most ionic substances will dissolve pretty readily. That's why salt dissolves in water really easily. Those ions actually dissociate. They separate from each other, and instead of having them attached to each other through this electromagnetic attraction, you have one positively charged ion surrounded by water molecules and a negatively charged ion surrounded by water molecules. Salt is another example of an ionic substance, and so sodium and chloride ions together make sodium chloride, which is table salt. And then sodium, as it turns out, is an incredibly important ion in living organisms. It powers all sorts of stuff. And we'll talk about it down the road, but essentially what happens is that your cells pump sodium out or in membranes, and then that sodium moves back where it was pumped from because of the concentration gradient, and cells use that concentration gradient to do things like put together ATP molecules. All right, the last kind of bond is a covalent bond. These are the strongest ones. These are where you have atoms that are sharing electrons, and you probably remember from chemistry, this is what happens when you have two atoms that are from the same region of the periodic table. They have about the same electronegativity, so they both hold on to those bonding electrons. And those attractions are still electromagnetic in nature, but because the electron or electrons haven't fully moved from one atom to another, we don't have ions, so they don't dissociate in solution. So you can dissolve covalent molecules, like you can take sugar and mix it in with water, it'll dissolve, but it's not dissociating the way that ionic compounds do. And then when we start next week, we're going to start talking about the main biochemical macromolecules. But as a sneak preview, we get these macromolecules when we hook together carbons in a variety of ways with a variety of other elements. And so the ones that we're going to be looking at are, I mean, we'll look at a bunch of things, but the main biochemical compounds are proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And since those are formed from carbon chains, and carbon-carbon bonds are covalent, our biochemical compounds are covalently bound molecules. And when we look at carbon compounds that are in or were created by living things, we call them organic molecules or compounds. So it's not just that it contains carbon, but that it contains carbon that was put together by a living organism. So organic compounds are what we're mostly going to be focusing on. And then I'm going to just show you really briefly some examples of organic molecules. You do not need to know these. You don't need to know the names. You should be familiar with the structural formulas, the dash line, the condensed dash line, and then just like leaving the carbons out. But we'll talk more about this later. Just know that in general, if you see a symbol like this, you should be able to identify where the carbons and where the hydrogens are. And I left this image up here, but there's a mistake. And I really, I like stuff like this. I like finding mistakes. Because, did you learn naming in chemistry? Yeah. So this is 1,3-butadiene, and so that means that the first and second carbon and the third and fourth carbon are hooked together with double bonds. But look, they drew it wrong. They show a carbon double bound to a hydrogen, and that doesn't ever happen. So this is, yeah, it's right here, yeah. And I like stuff. I mean, I don't like mistakes, but I think it's kind of fun to like find them, and it's a good reminder that even people, like whoever put this chart together, obviously knew what they were doing. They still made a mistake. That just happens. Okay, the things that that you're gonna need some reference for are called functional groups, and so functional groups are little chunks of elements. Some of them have carbon in them, and some of them don't have carbon in them, but they are attached to larger biochemical compounds. And they have a unique chemical structure. They're identifiable by the elements that are in them and by the bonds that those elements have. They all have names, many of which you've heard of, like you've almost certainly heard of amino, because when you learned about proteins, you learned about amino acids. They're called amino acids because they have this arrangement of a nitrogen and two hydrogens called an amino group. These functional groups do stuff. They actually do stuff. They're chemically reactive, and that's why they're important. That's why they're called functional groups, because they actually have a function. And we need to know them because we're going to refer to them. So you need to, like, they're used to name molecules, and we talk about them when we talk about phosphate groups. And we also group substances together, but based on the functional groups. So anything that has a hydroxyl will tend to have some similar properties. like the various alcohol groups, methanol and ethanol and stuff like that. So those organizational groups are important, and then determining function. So phosphate groups, for example, if you have 2 or 3 of them, are a great way to store energy, and so that's going to be useful for you to know. The rest is you. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is going to be something I want you to do over the weekend. You can use the rest of your class time today to do it as well. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take a sheet of paper. You can use 2, or it doesn't really matter how you do it, but you'll just divide it down the middle like this, and you'll put like the functional group here, and you will write the name of it and its function over here. So you can kind of do the fold and check. Like you could fold this part over and then look at the name here and see if you can remember what the functional group looks like, or you could fold the name part over and you can look at the group and see if you can remember what the name and the function is. These are not things that you're going to need to, this is not something where you're going to need to memorize all of them. So when you look at what is on the rest of the presentation, there's like 20 of them or something ridiculous like that. You don't have to memorize them all, but you should be familiar with them. They shouldn't be mysterious. And I want you to have this reference sheet because you can use this reference sheet in class, not on a test, but in other situations. So, so you're going to make your reference sheet, and this is going to be something where on Monday, I'm going to ask you to take a picture, turn the picture in on Canvas, and then turn in your note sheet to the bin, and then I'll grade them and I'll give them back to you, and you will have those to use whenever we need to know this stuff. Matt?
Is there a lot of organic chemistry on the AP Bio test?
So this first unit that we're working through is called Chemistry of Life, and is about 10% of the exam.
Okay.
Yeah.
So memorizing like function?
No. So you don't necessarily have to memorize it. That's what I want you to have the reference, because I want you to be able to use it. Realistically, you're not going to have to memorize all of these functional groups. It's just your life is going to be easier if you're familiar with them. Your life is going to be easier if you're not like, what in the world am I looking at or talking about here? Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. We have about a little bit more than 15 minutes. You can use your time in class to work on that. If you're still setting up your mung bean stuff, you can continue setting up your mung bean stuff. And if you would like, you're welcome to do the AP Classroom stuff now too. But the AP Classroom assignment and the functional group note sheets are due on Monday. And so I'm gonna have you submit a screenshot of your AP Classroom stuff, and I'm gonna have you turn in a picture and the hard copy of your functional group note sheet. Okay. All right. Let me know if you have any questions.